Well, thank you for tuning in today, and I hope you had a happy, albeit socially distant Easter. And I'm glad that you're taking some time to join with us as we continue our way through the book of 2 Corinthians. Our text today is going to be in 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 3 to chapter 7, verse 1, and we'll read it together on the screen here. We are putting no obstacle in anyone's way, so that no fault may be found with our ministry. But as servants of God, we have commended ourselves in every way, through great endurance, in afflictions, hardships, calamities, beatings, imprisonments, riots, labors, sleepless nights, hunger, by purity, knowledge, patience, kindness, holiness of spirit, genuine love, truthful speech, and the power of God, with the weapons of righteousness for the right hand and for the left, in honor and dishonor, in ill repute and good repute. We are treated as impostors, and yet are true, as unknown, and yet are well known, as dying, and see, we are alive, as punished, and yet not killed, as sorrowful, yet always rejoicing, as poor, yet making many rich, as having nothing, and yet possessing everything. We have spoken frankly to you, Corinthians. Our heart is wide open to you. There is no restriction in our affections, but only in yours. In return, I speak as to children. Open wide your hearts also. Do not be mismatched with unbelievers. For what partnership is there between righteousness and lawlessness? Or what fellowship is there between light and darkness? What agreement does Christ have with Belial? Or what does a believer share with an unbeliever? What agreement has the temple of God with idols? For we are the temple of the living God. As God said, I will live in them and walk among them, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. Therefore come out from them, and be separate from them, says the Lord, and touch nothing unclean. Then I will welcome you, and I will be your Father, and you shall be my sons and daughters, says the Lord Almighty. Since we have these promises, beloved, let us cleanse ourselves from every defilement of body and spirit, making holiness perfect in the fear of God. So at the beginning of chapter 6, verses 1 and 2, Paul is urging his readers not to accept the grace of God in vain. I think it's timely that we are looking at this text a week after we celebrated Easter, when we celebrate the moment that the full grace of God was on display, and is on display, frankly, through the death and resurrection of Christ. The question now is, following the Easter stories, how do we respond to such grace? And how do we not accept this grace in vain, as Paul put it in the first two verses? Well, starting in verse 3, Paul makes a bold statement about how his own ministry has not given his readers any excuses to question whether Paul has been genuine in responding to God's grace. If we recall, one of the major themes of 2 Corinthians is Paul's attempt to reconcile with the Corinthian church. But by this point in the letter, by chapter 6, Paul is writing very plainly to the Corinthian readers and inviting them to respond appropriately as followers of Christ. And how do they respond appropriately? Paul is basically saying, well, behave more like me, which is quite a strong thing to say. It would be like if you're watching this video right now and I was telling you, how do you be a better Christian? Well, look at my life and do what I do and you'll be a better Christian. It's a pretty strong statement to make. But the question then I have is, what gives Paul this kind of confidence that he's on the right path here, that his ministry is one to be emulated? Well, Paul explains then how they have endured very significant hardships, but they've done so with purity, knowledge, patience, kindness, holiness of spirit, genuine love, truthful speech, and the power of God. It is a sort of blueprint, if you will, of how we as followers of Christ ought to conduct ourselves in the face of hardships or circumstances that would test our patience, kindness, and truthfulness, etc. Speaking for myself, I know I struggle to often with responding to people who, when my patience and kindness is tested, and maybe I don't outwardly express frustration, but certainly inwardly I'm very frustrated at times. And it would be in most cases a lot easier to kind of let your guard down and respond to people emotionally or with cruelty. But when we ourselves view our lives in the context of the cross, and we think of ourselves as followers of Christ, then we ought to behave as Christ did and show grace and forgiveness. It is the right response that we should have when we think of ourselves in that context. So what is the reward that awaits us for enduring through patience and kindness? Well, Paul writes that for this, in his ministry, that he was treated as an imposter and punished. But Paul hits on another major theme in this letter, and it's the paradox of the cross. And I'm going to tease that for our next bit here. But before we get to that, I want you to do a talk with anybody you're with right now, or think about this question. Why would Paul continue in his ministry through great endurance in afflictions, hardships, calamities, beatings, imprisonments, riots, labors, sleepless nights, and hunger? If he's enduring all that because of his ministry, what made him think he's on the right track, and why would he continue to go on? So take a few moments and we'll come back and move along with the text. So just before we broke there for the question, I talked about this idea of Paul introducing the theme of the paradox of the cross. So what do we mean by that? Well, just a week ago we celebrated the coronation of Christ as king. And the way the coronation happened was through a Roman execution. It's not the typical way we would think of a coronation happening. But what we celebrate in the Easter story is, in part, the suffering that Jesus went through, how he was mocked with a crown of thorns meant to belittle and humiliate him. But yet it was through this suffering and humiliation and the acts that were meant to destroy him that God worked through those, not despite those events, and brought about his purposes. And it is an important point to distinguish between God working despite our suffering or God working through our suffering. And the one side of it is, if you think of God, working, against evil in that kind of more simplistic and dualistic sense, it doesn't give, I think, a full picture of what God's purposes are. So yes, Christ overcame death. There is that kind of good versus evil idea in there, but he didn't just overcome it. He willingly gave up his life and was willing to accept death. And it's that willingness to die that we can now have life. And the Bible is full of stories that touch on this kind of paradoxical way of life. The idea of where to die is to gain, and to be poor is to be made rich. And the story of the cross, it's important to know then, is it wasn't God's plan B. This wasn't that God designed things back in the Old Testament, we screwed it up, so then God had to scramble and come up with a quick fix or something like this. It was actually plan A from the beginning. The idea of that he was going to rescue the world through the cross and through Jesus dying and resurrecting again. And it's I think a more complex thing to think about, but it is important that we understand that God's sovereignty is absolute throughout it all. But it is in this paradoxical theme that Paul writes how, as followers of Christ, we follow a similarly paradoxical life. Paul explains that while they were unknown to the world, they are known by God. And it's an idea he comes up again with in 1 Corinthians 8, verse 3, as well as Galatians 4, verse 9. Paul also writes that they are seen as dying, and yet they live because Christ lives in us. And they endure punishments, yet God has protected them. They are seen as sorrowful, yet always rejoicing. And that idea is one of the greatest paradoxes of life. The idea of that you can experience suffering and we can experience loss in this life, yet we have a lifestyle where we're still able to rejoice and give praise to God. He writes again that they're seen as poor and yet making many rich by pointing others to the cross, seen as having nothing and yet possessing everything. And that again comes up in other of Paul's letters, in Philippians 3, verse 8, Romans 8, 17, and again 1 Corinthians 3, 21 to 23. This idea of the paradoxical life that we live as followers of Christ, just on a side note, it is exactly the opposite of what's being preached as the prosperity gospel, and which for some reason that's staggering to me is still being preached, and I can't figure that one out. But the reason this is the exact opposite is because if you look at the beginning of this text, Paul says he's removed obstacles in his ministry. And one of those obstacles is that someone may think that Paul is doing what he is doing just for money or for a life of ease. If anything, we've seen in Paul's ministry that the way he's gone about it has led him to often being homeless and battered and beaten. If he's doing this to gain wealth, he's not doing a very good job. And actually, it was a problem for him that he needed to address earlier in this letter when the Corinthian church was asking Paul to provide letters of recommendation, in part because they didn't think Paul was wealthy enough or had enough status, and he wasn't impressive enough in that way to maybe have authority. And Paul undercut that, if you go back, and was showing how that is a ridiculous way to look at things. You don't measure his success or his genuineness as an apostle of Christ through his material wealth. You look at it because he's delivering what's true and what the gospel is, and he's pointing others to Christ. That's the measure he talked about. So how does Paul commend his ministry? Well, it seems that he commends it through suffering, at least in part. And this idea again that God works not despite our suffering, but actually through our suffering. Now, we accept meaning through suffering, and that acceptance is attainable when we think of suffering that we can understand. Some suffering we can understand, like the suffering we inflict on ourselves. We all know we've gone through experiences where we've made mistakes, and you look back and go, yeah, I had to go through that, and that helped me to grow or helped me to overcome this problem in my life. Likewise, we can justify suffering that we even inflict on others as having some sort of meaning or higher purpose to it. We instinctively do this as parents. We actually will inflict suffering on our children, hopefully nothing too much, but the idea of disciplining your child so that they can grow and become better people and more self-sufficient and independent and grow as human beings. We do this naturally, right? You don't want a child that misbehaves all the time. You want to correct that behavior, and that sometimes can involve a bit of intentional discipline and suffering to be put on the child. But that kind of suffering is easy to understand when we say God can work through it. We tend to go to examples like that where it kind of fits nicely into that paradigm. But what is more difficult to understand and to wrestle with is when there is experiences in life where we suffer on a scale that seems disproportionate to any amount of good that may come as a result. We're living in a time right now where many may be experiencing this level of suffering where there seems to be no justification for this happening. We have thousands being infected with this disease that's going around. Millions are losing their jobs and their livelihoods. A lot of those would be permanent losses. Those aren't coming back anytime soon. So what possible good can come from a global pandemic that would justify this level of suffering? It's a harder question to wrestle with, and it's a harder statement to make that, well, it's okay because God will work through your suffering. It takes a bit more thought to come to terms with that. And I want to suggest that Paul's perspective is that the death and resurrection of Jesus gives us the assurance that God is still trustworthy even in the face of incomprehensible pain and suffering. Just to give an illustration, one of the more incredible stories in modern history is the story of the evacuation of soldiers from Dunkirk during World War II. And a few years ago, there was a movie made about it called Dunkirk. And if you haven't seen it, I highly recommend watching it. It's one of the more incredible stories. But basically, you had the British Army being trapped at Dunkirk, and they had two outcomes that were possible. Either Hitler's advancing armies were going to catch up with them and wipe them out, or they would get rescued. And even the percentages that were being suggested that would be able to be rescued were very low. And it was going to take a miracle to remove those people from that situation. During that time, there's a story of a naval officer that transmitted a message from Dunkirk back to England, and the message was just 3 words long, and the words were, "But if not." And what's amazing at that time is to think that there was a public that received that message and instantly interpreted it and knew exactly what it meant. And I'm not explaining it just yet, because I'm wondering if our society today, if we receive that message, would we know what it means, what the context is? Well, to kind of shed some light on it, what it's reference to is Daniel 3:16-18, and the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego facing death by fiery furnace. And they, in short, made this statement that God is capable of rescuing us from this situation, but if not, we'll still trust in him because we will wake to see him in glory. And it's this incredible perspective that we gain by the result of the cross, that we can go into life and we can face incomprehensible pain and suffering, knowing full well that we follow a God that can deliver us from that situation. But if not, he is still trustworthy, and we can still have that assurance and hope that if he doesn't rescue us immediately from that situation, we will wake again and see him face to face in glory. And it's only through that perspective, I think, that we can even begin to address this idea of incomprehensible suffering. Because the reality is, whether you follow Christ or not, you're going to be faced with suffering like that. How are you going to handle it if you don't have the cross? And so what's the alternative to the cross? Well, it's yourself. And you're not strong enough to overcome all the suffering that you're going to face in this life. What will give you that strength is following Christ and knowing that you have that assurance in him that he will work through it and do what is right by you. So with that, we're going to go to another table talk. And Paul writes that a Christian life is a paradoxical life. We are treated as impostors and yet are true, as unknown and yet are well known, as dying and see. We are alive, as punished and yet not killed, as sorrowful yet always rejoicing, as poor yet making many rich, as having nothing and yet possessing everything. So the question I want you to think about is, have you noticed this in your experience following Christ? Have you had a similar paradoxical theme come up in your life as a follower? So moving forward in our text into verses 14 and 18 of chapter 6, Paul moves from the paradox of his ministry and the Christian life to a discussion on how we are to live as temples of the living God. It's one of the most, I think, difficult concepts, at least for me, to understand, is that this idea that you and me, as followers of Christ, are described as the temple of God, that the place where God himself dwells. It's much easier, I think, to picture God's presence as placed in like a holy place or a temple or a church, some kind of place where we go to meet with God, and then we can leave that place and carry on with our lives. That picture seems a little more attainable, but when we read in the New Testament this theme of now the temple is not where God dwells within you, and that you are the temple of God. It's a much more staggering idea, and frankly a much more daunting idea, because with it, I think, carries a lot of responsibility that in the same way that you would make sure that a holy place would be well taken care of. You're not going to let it fall apart. But now that you are the temple of God, it's your responsibility to make sure you're taken care of as well, that you're doing what is right by yourself. You're not allowing things to defile the temple that is you now. So there is that burden that the same care should be taken to look after yourself. This part of the text, incidentally, has been used often as a way to say that Paul is addressing the issue of marriage. And while there's certainly some parallels that can be drawn from that, I think it's important to note that the words here actually don't specifically refer to marriage at all. In fact, the word marriage doesn't even appear in 2 Corinthians. The main concern in this text for Paul is not to allow idolatry a foothold in the Christian life. So as followers of Christ, we are called to distinction, and we should take that very seriously. We're to remain vigilant against any sort of idolatry so that we engage in the world in such a way that points others to the cross. So do not blend into the background and don't disappear from the picture entirely. So it raises an important issue, I think. If you have spent any time in church or around Christians, you probably heard something like the phrase that followers of Christ are to be called to be in the world, not of the world. It's an often used expression, and one of those expressions that gets used so often we kind of dismiss it, or we don't think about it too much. But as I see it, there are two extremes that Christians need to be aware of to avoid. And the first is perhaps the more obvious extreme, but it's the extreme of allowing your faith in Christ to become just another view in the marketplace of faiths and religions, as if it's just another option off the menu that you can select. To be a follower of Christ is to die to yourself, and that we read that throughout the New Testament. Paul's letters repeatedly make the point that the cross confronts everyone and demands a response. And there's an exclusivity that's there throughout the Bible and throughout the New Testament, that there's one way to God, and that's through Christ. So we can't allow ourselves to think of following Christ as just optional or as just another way. The Bible doesn't permit that kind of universalism. The other extreme, though, is to become so removed from the world altogether that we become of little or no earthly purpose. Christians can become so wrapped up in Christian culture and activities and entertainment that we forget Christ's commissioned to us to go into the world and to actually engage with it, with the purpose of pointing others to Christ and to the cross. So it seems that Paul's message here is to remain vigilant against allowing any sort of idolatry, any kind of foothold in your life. And idolatry is, again, one of those words we use in church a lot that maybe loses some meaning after time. But what we mean by idolatry is just anything that would take the place of God in your life, which in that sense, all sin is a sin of idolatry in some sense, because you're putting that action or that behavior ahead of what you know to be right and what God's plan is for you. So again, the message to remain vigilant against idolatry of any kind of foothold in your life, so that you are able to be engaged in the world and bring the good news of the gospel with authority and with humility. You make sure that you take care of yourself, but for the purpose of engaging in the world and pointing others to Christ. It's not to just remain in your little silo and you have your Christian club and you don't venture out for that. There's a purpose to why we are called to distinction and why we're called to be set apart, not that we stay removed, but that we are then able to engage in the world and do that with authority and humility. So it leads us to our last verse of the text, which is the call to cleanse yourself and to do what is right. And if you think you're good at this, cleansing yourself and doing what is right, I'm going to humbly suggest that you're probably deceiving yourself at some level, for the very simple reason that you don't get to decide what is right all the time. That's not your responsibility. Now, there are some obvious things in life that we all know are wrong and we should avoid. But what is more of a challenge is opening ourselves up to God's changing work in our lives. Part of the definition of being a follower of Christ is that you're allowing yourself to be open to Christ transforming you. And if you need transformation, that probably means there's something wrong in your life that needs to be corrected. You're not a perfect human being. So at this point, if you are one of those perfect people without flaws, you can probably stop watching now and have a good rest of your week. But if you are like me and you're deeply flawed and willing to look at what you need to do to address your flaws, then maybe we can discuss this a little bit of how we can let God do the work in our lives. Often what we think should happen or what we should do is not what God actually wills to happen, is one of the more challenging parts of being a Christian, I think. There's a bit of tension that we have in our relationship with God because we want to go one way and God often pulls us another way, or it's not exactly the way we wanted it. I remember reading in a book by G.K. Chesterton where he said one of the more maddening things about life is that life is almost rational. It's not that it's completely wrong or completely right. There's just that little bit of tension that we live with in life that can drive us a little bit insane. So how do we do this? How do we get ourselves lined up with what God is willing to happen? Well, a good place to start, and for a more full discussion, this probably needs another video or another sermon at some point, but a good place to start is through prayer. And to pray in a way that was illustrated by Jesus himself. The way prayer is often portrayed or is often used is as a way to try and get God to do things that we would like to see done. And in a sense, this is a part of prayer. I mean, we go around often and we ask people, is there anything I can pray for you about? Or we have our prayer requests or prayer chains, and people put in their, write down their wish lists, and then they send it off to everybody, please pray for this. And certainly we are to bring our requests to God. And while the intention can be good, I don't think it's an entirely correct approach to how we ought to pray. And we can fall into this kind of mindset that Martin Luther King Jr. once wrote, that we treat God as our cosmic bellhop in the sky, where we just send our requests and our wish lists up to him and just, try and bend him to our will kind of idea. But the purpose of prayer isn't to change God. The purpose of prayer is to change you. And that shifts the whole paradigm when you think of it in that way. So to kind of look at this, I want to take a look at the Lord's Prayer, because that's the template Jesus gave when you pray like this. You can find it in Matthew 6, 9 to 13. Pray then in this way: Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts, as we also have forgiven our debtors. And do not bring us to the time of trial, but rescue us from the evil one. The prayer begins with a very humble spirit, first of all, acknowledging God's rightful place and surrendering our own desires to conform to his will. That our Father in heaven, you're acknowledging who God is. He's in heaven, he has authority, he's the creator. Hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done. So right away we've got this posture of, I'm approaching God with the understanding that I want God's will to be done first, before I say anything else. God, you're in control, you're sovereign, you do what you will to be done, on earth as it is in heaven, which is another interesting thought, maybe for another time. But it then moves from this posture to a posture of gratitude and humbly asking God to give us what we need for the day, and not necessarily what we want. So hopefully those things line up. Like, hopefully what you need is what you want. But it's a request that God give us what we actually need. And from a day-to-day perspective, what you need every day is Christ. And that's, you see the daily bread, that should bring up images of, or remind you of when Christ said, I'm the bread of life. This idea that Christ is what we need to sustain us every day. It's through humility and gratitude that we are then prepared to forgive others, acknowledging that our ability to forgive others is made complete when we ourselves ask for forgiveness. So we ask God, please forgive us as I forgive others. There's a confessional, repentant attitude that we need to have when we approach God, that we're opening ourselves up now, acknowledging that we've done some things not quite right. We need God to come in and help us. And then in that way, when we're open that way, we can forgive others as well. We then ask God to protect us from sin and from idolatry that would lead us to unforgiveness and pride. And so the objective of the prayer is, again, not to bend God to our will. I do find it funny sometimes, growing up in church and being around a lot of different churches, that you'll often hear these really long-winded prayers, especially when they're public prayers. You get some holy person up there who grimaces really hard and uses very large vocabulary to try and make their point. It almost seems as if the whole purpose is to, if I only express myself emotionally enough, then that will be enough to, change God's mind, or I can really, that'll be the prayer that's most effective. God isn't activated until I really am very sincere in my faith. And it's kind of funny, because at the same time we'll sing songs about how come as you are, Christ invites you just as you are, so come talk to him. But when you do, make sure you grimace and you really, do it this way. It's kind of, I find it just very amusing. But I think the idea when we read the Lord's Prayer and we read Paul and how his attitude is that you speak to God as yourself, but you know who you're speaking to, and you be appropriately humble and open for God to work in you. So the unifying theme throughout the whole prayer is for you to be conformed to God's will, and then to behave in a way that is in accordance with his will and justice. It doesn't mean we don't give our requests to God, but I think we lift them up with an open hand and say, God, this is what I want, but ultimately, please give me what I need, and I trust that your will is better, so help me understand and have your mindset as I go forward in life. So with that, we're going to come to an end, and I want you to take time to pray. If you're by yourself, just take a moment to pray by yourself. If you're with a few other people, pray as a group, and encourage one another. And for the rest of this week, please stay safe, and God bless you.